Welcome to another book review. Today I have for you Ernst Jünger's Storm of Steel. This is written by a German during World War I who was an infantryman, and it tells of his story, his direct experiences during the war. If you compare this to another book such as Eric Maria Remarque's All Quiet on the Western Front, you can see the vast differences between what it is to use your own notes and diary notes and personal account versus using an alter ego or a different character to tell a story. In this book, it sort of goes through his whole experiences during the war, but the chapters are basically named by location. Many of these being famous names we'd all somewhat recognize, such as the Battle of the Somme, Flanders, and Cambrai. Ernst Jünger was born to be a soldier. This guy is a character for sure. He joined the French Foreign Legion when he was 18. For those of you who don't know, the French Foreign Legion is actually a part of the French military where they accept foreigners to come fight for France. And it's basically, there's no real good reason to do that unless you are, half French or born somewhere else, unless you're just a soldier who wants to fight. And that's what Ernst Jünger was and probably always would have been during his life, a soldier. He was born in 1895, so then he sort of came back to Germany during the World War I period, starting in 1914, I think, and he joined the army there and then he was fighting in the trenches. He rose to a lieutenant, and during the war he was hurt 14 times, I believe, 7 of those being very badly. At the end, he got shot through the chest and sort of recovered from that, God knows how, and continued to live a very long life until the age of 103, I believe, which is he died in 1998, I believe. He was the youngest and therefore the oldest, well, not therefore, but he was the youngest receiver of the Pour le Mérite, or pronouncing that terribly, but it was basically Germany's highest military honor. This was awarded roughly 700 times during the war, and mostly to senior ranking officials, but a couple of times as well to the lower level infantrymen, basically for doing insane things, proving yourself in the course of battle and showing that you are committed to the cause, that you are worthy of the greatest honors. So he was the oldest living recipient of this until he died in 1998. There's a little bit of controversy regarding him. I personally don't see it. The book itself, I guess, is somewhat glorifying of war if you compare it to many other books. But even when it was released in 1920, it actually sort of had a controversy in the other sense, which was he does talk about his fears and the fear of the soldier during his experiences, which in 1920 was considered a little bit risky, a little bit, you're not, as a man, you're not meant to show these sorts of things. So nowadays it's considered in a different light, but even back when it was first published, it was sort of seen the reverse. It was a bit too soft. It was a bit not glorifying war enough. And I wouldn't even say he really glorifies war. It's more just his personal account of what he experienced during the war. So that sort of controversy aspect of it, I find a little bit ridiculous, but whatever. People can do what they want. Do and say what they want. So some of the themes of the book, the excitement of the fight, and for him, this is both the good and the bad. So he was excited during the rushes where he would, charge and there'd be shellings, but also the vice versa where he is getting attacked. He's having to defend his life. The patrols, the sneak attacks, whatever it was, the death, the steel, the rotting corpses, everything about war excited him, and I think he enjoyed excitement. So I would say, it's an interesting aspect of war that some people really enjoy it, and you can see this in there's a movie as well. I can't remember what it's called. A very famous American one, whatever. Some of the quotes from this book, and I'll read a couple here just to give you an aspect of what his personality was like and how he thought about things and wrote. So this is just one of the interesting things I found. To quote, "During one stop on the way, a driver split his thumb in the course of crank-starting his lorry. The sight of the wound almost made me ill. I have always been sensitive to such things. I mention this because it seems virtually unaccountable as I witnessed such terrible mutilation in the course of the following days. It's an example of the way in which one's response to an experience is actually largely determined by its context. This is really interesting. So he's talking about how even though he was going through these terrible periods, these crazy, disgusting things that he was seeing, in the context of war, it was okay. He could handle it. But then in the non-context of war, when he was just traveling between sites, he sees someone split open their thumb and he gets sickened by it and can't stand it. So this is one of those things where I suppose it's like, you've got to understand during war, you're going to do things and have to do things which are messed up, taking people's lives and whatnot, which it does make you a killer. But then in the non-context of war and civilian peacetime, I don't think it's fair to really point at someone and say, oh, you're a killer, you murdered people, and view it in that same light. So he sort of expresses that here, and I think that's a fairly poignant thing to talk about. There's another little chapter that I enjoyed, or I suppose really shows what Ernst Jünger is capable of writing, because he does have some very beautiful writing. And to quote, "In the evenings, I took a stick out of the corner and strolled along narrow footpaths that went winding through the hilly landscape. The neglected fields were full of flowers, and the smell grew headier and wilder by the day. Occasional trees stood beside the paths, under which a farm worker might have taken his ease in peacetime, bearing white or pink or deep red blossoms, magical apparitions in the solitude. Nature seemed to be pleasantly intact, and yet the war had given it a suggestion of heroism and melancholy. Its almost excessive blooming was even more radiant and narcotic than usual. It's easier to go into battle against such a setting than in a cold, wintry scene. The simple soul is convinced here that his life is deeply embedded in nature and that his death is no end." Yeah, poignant stuff. He writes heavy things. There's other memorable quotes in this book where he's talking of how he was digging in the trenches and he was coming across people who had been buried in 1914, and he was sort of creating his own trench by digging through their graveyards and remarking on how the earth had already tasted blood in this area. Deep stuff, deep and heavy stuff. One of the other quotes, and this is not written in this book, but is just of Ernst Jünger in general, and I think speaks to his character and what he was about. "What doesn't kill me makes me stronger, and what kills me makes me incredibly strong." What kind of madman would write something like that, or have expressed that sentiment? He's he's definitely a person who is very intense and very, I guess, eager for life in the sense that he lives it to the fullest. One of the other things in this book in particular are the tricks and turns of fate, and the perception of this seems to be enhanced during extremes. He has very, very many scenes in the book where he talks about how he was sitting somewhere and someone pulls him down and then a sniper bullet will graze over his hair, touch his hair. The amount of times he got shrapnel whizzing past, touching going through his helmet, but just barely scraping his scalp, or how the person next to him, a bomb would explode right in front of them. The person next to him would be riddled with shrapnel and he's just there standing fine. This happened a couple of times. One in particular, very memorable moment where he's taking his whole platoon, and they're just waiting for this offensive, and a shell comes right in, lands in the middle of them, and I guess like half of the 40 or 50 guys that he has are killed or wounded. And yeah, it's just like, oh, he survives, and the dude next to him and the dude on either side of him is killed. So it's just, the tricks and turns of fate are really amplified during war. We might not see this as much in our normal lives, but it's still there. The decisions that we make, the small ones, they can have big impacts, but in war, you can definitely see the real contrast between life and death. Some of my own observations from the book. Nowadays, I think you'd describe him as an adrenaline junkie. He definitely, there's a palpable sense of anticipation and fear, but it's also exciting, stimulating, and he's passionate about what he's doing while fighting. The narration style and I guess his use of words really expresses this, where He's more focusing on the events and not so his reactions to them, but not so much the people or the characters in the book. There's only a couple of instances where he really shows his own. Well, he talks about his fear, but he doesn't show what the other characters are feeling. What I guess like the general sense or the general mood is. It's a very introspective on himself, and he is a person who loves adrenaline, and he'll get his kicks from war. But I think if he was, born nowadays and didn't have a war to fight in, he would be one of those dudes base jumping, skydiving, doing all those crazy things. As I just mentioned, the focus is on the actions and events, not the people. And if you contrast that to All Quiet on the Western Front, it's a very, very different novel in the sense that he cares about the events. All Quiet on the Western Front is about the people and their reactions to it. With these two books as well, and I have both of them here with me, it's the same events but different opinions. So in All Quiet on the Western Front, he's very scathing of, I guess, the atmosphere of what war is and what it was portrayed to be. Whereas Ernst Jünger is definitely the typical, what you would imagine, soldier, like the fearless, not fearless, but courageous soldier. He feels fear, but still does it anyway. Whereas Remarque is basically pointing out that, look, you can do that, but it's still senseless in the end. The amount of blood, violence, and wiping out of a generation is, I guess, just a tragedy in its own way. That being said, both of these books are similar in some ways in that both are apolitical. They don't really talk about the ethics of why war is happening, why it should be fought, why it shouldn't be fought. Both of them just say, this is my personal experience during the war, and that's how it is. Neither is right or wrong either. Both, I think that should be mentioned. Like neither of these books is, you can say, yep, that's exactly what war is. No, both of them are right, and that's just one of the things in life that you have to understand, that a thing can be two things. It isn't just one thing sometimes. And it's how your perceptions of it shape it. And so I would say that it's probably largely determined by personality, because the events that they both went through, I would say, sound roughly the same. But obviously one came from it with a sense of, I guess, this is making me stronger. And the other was like, this is just senseless. Why are we doing this? One thing I think as well, just to observe about Ernst Jünger in general in his life, is that you can't define someone by just one thing. And if you read this book and said, okay, he's a war junkie, he glorifies war, that really doesn't take into account all the other things he did in his life. He was one of the first people to try out LSD, and he was very passionate, I suppose, in talking about that and the internal experiences of psychedelics. He during World War II, he somewhat helped Jews, and when he was positioned in France as I think it was a communications officer or something like that, he wrote 50 books. He had 2 children. One of them died during World War II when he was captured, and then later either killed or died in the course of being a prisoner of war, I believe. And the other committed suicide later. So he had a large, varied, rich life, and I would say it's very, very unfair if you're going to pick on him and say this is exactly what he was or who he is because he wrote this one book, which has some aspects of glorifying war. And that's not even, I wouldn't even say that is what you should take away from this book. But yeah, some of the things I read online while researching this was, not too kind on him. And I felt that was rather unfair. So in summary, it's a tale of war as real as it gets. He was in this war for a long time, multiple years, I believe, on the front fighting, and he was a courageous, amazing person. And if you can't take that away from this book, I think you shouldn't be reading it because it's just like the way he acts and who he is as a person is really encapsulated in this book. And there's definitely something admirable of his attitude and just the type of person that he was. For me, the book, I would say I just found a little bit repetitive in some parts. he talks about very similar experiences of fighting and the shelling, and you get a feel for it rather quick. I felt like I probably could have read about 2/3 of it, and the last third, wouldn't have added that much to it, but it's still a great book, and you might as well read it all the way through. And I did, though I would say it's not all about glorifying war, I personally would have said it probably feels a bit too much for me. It feels a bit too much excitement, too much enjoyment from that, and I couldn't really place myself in his character's head. Whereas with All Quiet on the Western Front, I definitely could understand that character a little bit more. Both were interesting. Both talked about different aspects of the war. And, I think this is one of the things that should be taken away as well, is that war is not just one thing. It's multiple different things, and it's how you perceive it and how you choose to perceive it as well. So all in all, I'm giving it a 6.5 out of 10, mostly just because that was like, my rating system is based mostly on what I took from the book, but also my enjoyment while reading it. And yeah, I'd just say, like, at some parts I found it a bit repetitive, so I was like, whatever. My pragmatic observation or thing to take from after reading this is it's good to read books in pairs of 2, I think, or maybe even more. I think I've got like a lot more of a nuanced view of World War One, or at least the personal experience of that, from reading these 2 books very closely and similar, and in a similar amount of time, and being able to contrast them. Whereas if I just read one, I would have come from it with just one perspective, and especially when these 2 books are pretty opposed diametrically in the sense of what the author is communicating and the message that comes out of it. So that's it for today. Ernst Jünger's Storm of Steel. Hope you enjoyed.